The summer of 1852 arrived in Milledgeville, Georgia, with a suffocating weight that seemed to press the very air from the lungs of the city. As the state capital, the town pulsed with the rhythmic pretension of political maneuvering, a stark contrast to the silence of the surrounding cotton fields. At the epicenter of this social web stood the Vance Estate, a sprawling monument to ambition, constructed of red brick and white pillars, built upon the labor of 312 souls held in bondage. Senator Julian Vance, a man whose influence stretched from the Capitol Dome to the furthest reaches of the county, presided over this domain with the calculating precision of a general. To the outside observer, the Vance family represented the pinnacle of Southern aristocracy, a lineage of unbroken success. Yet, archival correspondence recovered from the period suggests a fracturing reality behind the facade, a family structure held together by obligation and the fear of a father who viewed human lives, including his daughters, as variables in a grander economic equation. Evelyn Vance, 24 years old and strikingly intelligent, occupied a precarious position within the household. Recent historical analysis of her childhood diary reveals a young woman deeply critical of the peculiar institution that funded her education, yet trapped by the social contract of her class. She moved through the mansion's high-ceilinged hallways like a spectral figure, present for meals and social calls, but mentally absent, retreating into a fortress of silence. The local gossip columns, preserved in the Milledgeville Gazette, frequently lamented her stubborn refusal to accept any of the suitors paraded before her. Her father's patience, however, was a finite resource that was rapidly depleting. The ledger books from that specific year show a sharp increase in the senator's entertainment expenses, a euphemism for the elaborate dinners designed to showcase his only daughter to potential political allies, treating her debutante status as a liquid asset to be traded for influence in the upcoming gubernatorial race. The atmosphere within the estate grew heavier as July waned. Julian Vance had set his sights on a strategic alliance with a prominent shipping magnate from Savannah, a man whose fortune was built on the Atlantic trade routes. Letters discovered in the senator's study, dated July 14, 1852, detail the negotiation of a dowry that included not only land, but also the transfer of specific skilled laborers. This business-like approach to his daughter's future created a palpable tension that even the house staff felt acutely. According to oral histories passed down through descendants of the enslaved community, the big house became a place of hushed warnings during those weeks. The domestic staff, attuned to the moods of their owners, navigated the rooms with heightened caution. Evelyn's mother, Lavinia, offered no resistance to her husband's plans, retreating instead into a world of nervous ailments and afternoon fainting spells, leaving her daughter isolated against the rising tide of her father's expectations. Overseeing the daily operations of the Vance holdings was Mr. Silas Graves, a man whose name still evokes a sense of dread in local folklore. Unlike the senator, who maintained a veneer of civility, Graves operated with a blunt, terrifying efficiency. Born of poor white stock, he had climbed to his position through a ruthless dedication to the hierarchy of the South, enforcing discipline with a cruelty that bordered on sadism. His logbooks, dry and factual, reduce human suffering to mere notes on productivity and punishment. Entries from the summer of 1852 frequently mention correctional measures administered for minor infractions, establishing a regime of terror that kept the workforce compliant. Graves viewed the enslaved population not as people, but as inventory, and he guarded that inventory with a possessive jealousy. His presence on the grounds was a constant reminder of the violence that underpinned the genteel society of Milledgeville, a shadow that stretched long across the manicured lawns. The heat reached its zenith in the final week of July, a relentless force that turned the air into a thick, humid haze. Senator Vance, feeling the pressure of the upcoming election cycle, summoned Evelyn to his study on the afternoon of July 29th. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, the scent of power. He did not mince words. Pointing to a letter on his desk, he announced that Mr. Arthur Barrow, the Savannah industrialist, would be arriving within the month to finalize the arrangement. The senator's tone left no room for negotiation. He spoke of duty and legacy, framing the marriage as a necessary consolidation of power. Evelyn stood motionless, her face a mask of porcelain calm, while internally the foundations of her world began to crack. She understood clearly that her consent was not required, only her obedience. This moment, documented in the searing emotional aftermath of her private writings, marked the point where the abstract threat of marriage became a concrete, imminent reality. Returning to her chamber, Evelyn felt the walls of the mansion closing in around her. The thought of a life bound to a man like Barrow, a stranger whose reputation for coldness was well known, was a suffocating weight. She needed air, space to breathe outside the perfumed stagnation of the drawing room. Changing into a simple walking dress, she slipped out through the garden terrace, avoiding the main thoroughfares where she might be seen. Her path took her past the manicured rose bushes and toward the service areas at the back of the property. It was here, away from the main house, that the sounds of the estate were different, less refined, more rhythmic. The sharp, metallic ringing of a hammer striking an anvil drifted through the humid air, a percussive beat that seemed to echo the pounding of her own heart. Drawn by the sound, she followed the path toward the source, a brick outbuilding situated behind the stables. The forge stood as a separate world from the main residence, a place of fire and sweat rather than polish and pretense. Pausing at the open doorway, Evelyn observed the interior, bathed in the orange glow of the hearth. A man stood at the anvil, his physique powerful and defined by years of labor. This was Caleb, the estate's blacksmith, a man whose reputation for skill was matched only by his reputation for silence. He was shaping a wrought iron railing, the metal twisting under his hands with surprising grace. Historical records indicate Caleb had been purchased by the Vance family 5 years prior, brought down from Virginia for a sum of $1,200, a high price that reflected his exceptional skill. Watching him work, Evelyn saw a focus and autonomy that she herself lacked. He controlled the fire. He shaped the iron. In that moment, she was not observing property, but an artisan in his element. Caleb paused his work, sensing a presence at the threshold. He turned, his face streaked with soot and sweat, and met Evelyn's gaze. In the South of 1852, such a look was a transgression, a violation of the strict social order. A white woman did not look an enslaved man in the eye with such openness, yet he did not immediately avert his eyes. There was a flash of curiosity in his expression, quickly masked by the necessary subservience of his position. He set down his hammer and wiped his hands on a rag, his posture stiffening into formal deference. "Miss Evelyn," he said, his voice low and steady, lacking the fear she had expected. The sound of her name on his lips, stripped of the honeyed flattery of her suitors, sounded different, more real. She realized she had stepped into a space where the rules of the parlor did not apply, and the danger of that realization sent a thrill through her. "My horse has thrown a shoe," Evelyn said, the lie forming quickly on her lips. It was a flimsy pretext, and they both knew it. The horse in question was stabled elsewhere, and Caleb was well aware of the animals under his care. He studied her for a fraction of a second, his dark eyes seeing through the fabrication, but he chose not to challenge it. Instead, he nodded slowly, accepting the narrative she offered. "I can see to it, miss. he replied, picking up a pair of tongs. "Though the heat is fierce today, you might find it uncomfortable here." It was a gentle rebuke, a reminder that she did not belong in this soot-stained sanctuary. But Evelyn did not move. She took a step further into the forge, drawn by an invisible thread, the stifling heat of the room far preferable to the stifling future awaiting her in the main house. Unbeknownst to them, the geometry of the estate allowed for clear sightlines from the upper windows of the overseer's cottage. Silas Graves stood at his vantage point, a spyglass in hand, watching the scene unfold with the detachment of a predator observing prey. He had noted Evelyn's earlier departure from the main house and had followed her progress out of idle curiosity. Now, seeing her enter the forge alone, standing in close proximity to the blacksmith, his lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. Graves was a man who understood the value of information in a slave society. An improper intimacy, even one imagined, was leverage. He did not intervene. Instead, he observed, cataloging the interaction in his mind. The owner's daughter, alone with a field hand turned blacksmith, was a variable he could exploit. He tucked the spyglass into his coat and made a mental note, the first entry in a mental ledger that would soon threaten them all. The following morning, the humidity in Milledgeville had intensified, transforming the air into a visible haze that clung to the riverbanks. Evelyn awoke with a sense of purpose that had been absent from her mornings for years. While her mother, Lavinia, remained sequestered in her chambers with a cool cloth pressed to her forehead, Evelyn dressed with deliberate efficiency, bypassing the intricate crinolines favored by society for a more practical walking dress. She informed the kitchen staff, through a carefully constructed falsehood, that she intended to inspect the rose gardens for blight. Instead, her trajectory carried her past the manicured hedges and toward the service road. The psychological pull of the forge was inexplicable, a defiance of the social gravity that kept women of her station on the veranda. Historians studying the psychological profiles of women in the antebellum South often note this specific type of risk-taking behavior as a reaction to extreme domestic confinement, a precursor to the radical breaks that would characterize the decade's later social upheavals. Approaching the outbuilding a second time, the rhythmic clang of metal against metal sounded different to her ears, less like industrial noise and more like a signal. She found the forge door ajar, the interior dark and cool compared to the previous day's inferno. Caleb was not at the anvil, but stood by a workbench, sorting through a pile of scrap iron. He wore a coarse linen shirt today, stained with grease, and his expression upon seeing her was one of guarded alarm rather than welcoming curiosity. He immediately ceased his sorting, his body tensing as if anticipating a blow. This reaction, a conditioned response to the unpredictable nature of white authority, underscored the peril of her presence. Evelyn hesitated at the threshold, acutely aware that crossing it signaled a deliberate abandonment of propriety. The silence between them stretched, heavy with the unspoken rules they were actively dismantling, until she took the definitive step inside, letting the door creak shut behind her. "You returned," Caleb stated, his voice devoid of inflection, a statement of fact rather than a question. He did not address her by title, a small but significant omission that Evelyn noted immediately. She moved toward the workbench, her fingers brushing the cool surface of a finished iron railing similar to the one she had observed him crafting the day before. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the metal twisted into elegant curves that belied the brutality of the environment in which it was created. "The railing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is for the new library in town." Caleb nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. Senator Vance requires it by the week's end, he replied. It is to be a gift to the city council. The irony of a blacksmith laboring in bondage to create a symbol of civic enlightenment was not lost on either of them, adding a layer of bitter irony to the transaction. Evelyn picked up a heavy iron latch from the workbench, examining the mechanism with feigned interest. In reality, she was stalling, trying to formulate a reason for her visit that transcended the forbidden desire for simple conversation. Caleb watched her, his posture rigid, the muscles in his jaw working silently. Miss Evelyn, he said finally, breaking the standoff, if Mr. Graves were to find you here... He let the threat hang unfinished in the air. The mention of the overseer's name served as a sudden, chilling injection of reality into their private sanctuary. Evelyn set the latch down with a sharp click. Mr. Graves does not dictate my movements on my father's property, she countered, though the tremor in her voice undermined the bravado of her statement. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Graves represented the violent enforcement of the very laws that kept Caleb in chains and Evelyn in a gilded cage. Just as the words left her lips, the heavy thud of boots on the packed earth outside froze them both in place. Caleb stepped away from her instantly, his body shifting into a posture of subservience, his head lowering. Evelyn turned toward the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. The door swung open, and Silas Graves filled the frame, his pale eyes scanning the dim interior with predatory efficiency. The lighting in the forge cast deep shadows, obscuring the subtleties of their previous body language, but the proximity was undeniable. Graves entered slowly, his riding crop tapping rhythmically against his boot. The air in the room seemed to drop in temperature. Miss Vance, he said, his voice dripping with a mock politeness that failed to reach his eyes. Your mother is asking for you. She seems distressed that you have abandoned your morning rounds. Evelyn forced herself to meet the overseer's gaze, channeling every ounce of aristocratic training she possessed into her expression. I was merely inspecting the progress on the library railing, she said smoothly, gesturing toward the workbench. My father takes a personal interest in the city council's appreciation. Graves stepped closer to the railing, running a gloved finger along the ironwork, but his attention remained fixed on Evelyn. He turned his gaze toward Caleb, who stood motionless as a statue. The blacksmith has his orders, Graves said, his tone hardening. I am sure he can manage his work without supervision from the main house. He lingered on the word supervision, imbuing it with a double meaning that felt like a physical intrusion. The tension in the room was taut enough to snap. The overseer was marking his territory, asserting his authority over both the enslaved man and the senator's daughter in a single calculated sentence. It is a marvel of craftsmanship, is it not? Evelyn replied, ignoring the barb and refusing to be cowed into a hasty retreat. She walked toward the door, forcing Graves to step aside or block her path. He chose to step aside, a smirk playing on his lips. Indeed, he murmured. Though iron is dangerous to handle, Miss Vance, it is heavy, unforgiving, and prone to rust if not kept in its proper place. The metaphor was crude but effective. Evelyn swept past him without another word, her gait measured and calm, betraying none of the panic rising in her throat. As she stepped out into the blinding midday sun, she heard Graves speaking low to Caleb, his voice shifting from sarcasm to a menacing growl. She did not turn back, knowing that to look over her shoulder would be to admit guilt. The distance to the main house had never felt so vast, the exposure of the open lawn suddenly terrifying. Back in the forge, the atmosphere had turned poisonous. Graves circled Caleb, who remained staring at the floor, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. You think yourself clever, boy. Graves whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the dying fire. "You think because the senator brings you special tools and pays you a mind, you are different from the field hands?" He struck the workbench with his crop, sending a shower of sparks from a stray piece of slag. "You are a tool, Caleb. Nothing more. And if I see the missus to be darken this door again for anything other than a bill of sale, I will dull your edge myself." He did not need to specify the punishment. The history of the Vance plantation was written in the scars on the backs of men who had forgotten their place. The overseer left the threat hanging in the air like soot, turning on his heel and slamming the door behind him, plunging the room back into shadow. Evelyn reached the main house breathless, her skin prickling with the heat and the adrenaline. She found her mother in the drawing room, not ill as Graves had claimed, but nervously embroidering a handkerchief. Lavinia looked up at her daughter's entrance, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and knowing. "Where have you been, Evelyn?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Mr. Graves came in person to tell me you were at the forges, Evelyn. Why?" The question was not an accusation, but a plea. Evelyn stared at her mother, seeing for the first time the cracks in the older woman's composure. "I was looking for something real, Mother," Evelyn said softly. The answer confused Lavinia, but she did not press, instead returning to her needlework with a frantic energy. The incident had been contained for the moment, but the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The estate was no longer a collection of separate worlds. The walls between the big house and the quarters were becoming permeable. That night, the senator's study glowed late into the evening. Julian Vance sat at his desk, reviewing the plantation's quarterly expenses, while Graves stood opposite him, hat in hand. The overseer did not mention the incident at the forge directly. To accuse the senator's daughter of impropriety without concrete evidence would be professional sabotage. Instead, he sowed seeds of strategic concern. "The new security measures for the Barrow visit, Senator," Graves began. "I suggest we limit the movement of the household staff to the immediate grounds. There has been restlessness." It was a lie, but a useful one. He was positioning himself as the essential gatekeeper, the only barrier between order and the chaos he implicitly threatened. Vance nodded absently, his mind on the upcoming marriage contract, unaware that his trusted overseer was cataloging his daughter's transgressions for future leverage. The silence of the house belied the complex web of surveillance tightening around its inhabitants. The following day, Evelyn remained in her room, claiming the heat had given her a migraine. From her window, she watched the forge, a dark smudge against the green of the lawn. She saw Caleb emerge to pump water from the well, his shirt removed, revealing the muscles of his back glistening in the sun. From this distance, he looked less like a piece of property and more like a man trapped in a cage of her father's making. The memory of Graves's sneer and Caleb's terrified stillness solidified her resolve. The moral thesis of her life, that safety was worth the price of silence, had been shattered. The system she had tolerated was not merely oppressive, it was predatory. As she watched Caleb disappear back into the darkness of the forge, she realized the attraction she felt was inextricably linked to a shared desire for escape, a recognition of a spirit that refused to be broken by the heat, the whip, or the suffocating weight of Southern tradition. The social calendar of Milledgeville's elite functioned as a carefully staged theater, designed to reinforce hierarchies and broker alliances. On the evening of August 2nd, 1852, the Vance residence hosted a dinner that, according to archived guest lists, included the state's most influential cotton merchants. Evelyn moved through the crowd like an automaton, her hand numb from the feigned pleasantries of men who viewed her as a conduit to her father's power. The centerpiece of the evening, however, was not the roasted quail, but the arrival of Arthur Barrow. He was a man of 45 years. His fortune derived from the mechanization of the textile trade, a detail that made him both modern and distasteful to the old guard. His eyes, pale and calculating, tracked Evelyn across the dining room. Correspondence from a guest present that evening describes the suitor as possessing a disposition better suited to a counting house than a courtship, a chilling indictment of the match being negotiated. Senator Vance called Evelyn into his study following the final brandy, the heavy oak doors sealing them away from the lingering guests. The room was a shrine to his ambition, lined with ledgers that detailed the human cost of his prosperity. He did not sit, but stood by the window, his back to her, outlining the terms of her future as if reading a contract. Barrow is prepared to settle a dowry of $6,000, he stated, the number hanging in the humid air like a sentence. This union secures our interests in the railroads, Evelyn. It is not a request. The financial specificity of the arrangement stripped away any remaining illusion of romantic or familial sentiment. She was being sold, the transaction differing from the sales at the slave market only in the currency of respectability involved. Her silence was interpreted as consent, a fatal miscalculation by a father who had ceased to see his daughter as a thinking entity. Retreating to her chamber, Evelyn felt the suffocating grip of the upcoming marriage. Barrow's touch during their brief introduction had been proprietary, his gaze lingering on her form with the cold assessment he might apply to livestock. She penned a single frantic entry in her journal that night, the ink bleeding into the paper. I am to be caged with a wolf. The metaphor was apt. Barrow's reputation for cruelty toward his workforce was whispered even in the drawing rooms of Milledgeville. The marriage, scheduled for the autumn, would remove her from her father's house, only to place her in a more rigid prison. Her previous transgressions, the visits to the forge, now seemed like the desperate actions of a drowning woman. The timeline set by her father allowed for no maneuverability, compressing her options into a narrowing corridor of compliance or ruin. The following morning, Graves's presence on the estate felt less like supervision and more like a military occupation. He had repositioned his rounds to intersect with Evelyn's habitual walking paths, his gaze a physical weight upon her. The overseer understood the politics of the big house intimately. He knew that the upcoming marriage elevated his own importance. A nervous bride meant a family vulnerable to scandal, and scandal was a currency Graves hoarded. He cornered Evelyn near the stables, doffing his hat with a performative deference that mocked her station. I've increased the night patrols, Miss Vance, he said, his voice low. Wouldn't want any incidents, spoiling the senator's negotiations. The pause was a scalpel, dissecting her composure. He was warning her that her movements were being cataloged with the same precision as the cotton yields, and that he stood ready to report any deviation to Barrow. The pressure of the engagement and Graves's surveillance drove Evelyn toward a reckless decision. She could not wait for a safe moment. She needed to confirm that the connection in the forge was not a hallucination, born of desperation. Late that afternoon, under the guise of visiting the family cemetery, a common grieving ritual for Southern women, she detoured toward the industrial quarter of the estate. The heat was relentless, a shimmering wall that distorted the horizon. She found Caleb outside the forge, tempering a set of wagon tires in a trough of water. The steam rose around him, obscuring his features momentarily. This time, there was no pretext of a broken shoe. She stopped at the edge of the workspace, her hands trembling inside her lace gloves. Mr. Barrow has made an offer, she said, her voice cracking. My father has accepted. Caleb straightened slowly, wiping the soot from his brow with a rag. The news hung between them, heavy and portentous. He did not feign ignorance of the situation. The gossip of the enslaved community was often faster and more accurate than the household accounts. "Arthur Barrow," he repeated, the name sounding like a verdict. "He owns a plantation near the coast. They say he works his people to death in 3 years." The statement was a recitation of fact, devoid of self-pity, but heavy with implication. He looked at Evelyn, really looked at her, and for the first time, the barrier of social station seemed to dissolve in the heat. "You are afraid," he observed. It was not a question. It was an acknowledgement of their shared vulnerability, a recognition that the system that commodified him was now moving to consume her. "Terrified," she admitted, the confession tearing at her composure. "I cannot breathe in this place, Caleb. I cannot become his property." The word hung in the air, bridging the chasm between the white mistress and the enslaved blacksmith. She stepped closer, violating the invisible line that Graves had redrawn in his mind. "You have known fear your entire life," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I see it in your eyes every time Graves passes. But I also see something else. I see a man who refuses to break." Caleb's expression flickered, a war between the caution that had kept him alive and the dangerous hope that her words ignited. He glanced toward the overseer's cottage in the distance, a speck of white against the tree line. "Speaking this way is death, Miss Evelyn," he warned, though he did not step back. "If we are caught speaking of anything but iron, we are dead." "Then let us speak of iron," Evelyn countered, her mind racing. "You have built things that hold together under immense pressure. Is there no structure that can hold us?" The metaphor was clumsy, but Caleb understood it. He looked down at his hands, stained with the evidence of his trade, and then back at her face. "Iron holds," he said softly, "but it also breaks if struck in the right place." It was a philosophical admission, a crack in the armor of his daily existence. He was acknowledging that he, too, had thought of breaking the shackles. The air between them was charged with a new, dangerous electricity, the recognition of an ally in enemy territory. They were no longer simply mistress and slave. They were conspirators in a rebellion yet to be defined. The moment of intimacy was shattered by the distant, rhythmic beat of horse hooves on the packed earth of the main road. A rider was approaching at speed. Caleb immediately stepped back, his posture stiffening into the mask of subservience. "Go," he urged, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The patrols are changing." Evelyn turned, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She walked swiftly back toward the main house, not looking back, acutely aware of how exposed they had been. The rider turned out to be a courier bearing letters for the senator, but the scare served as a brutal reminder of the surveillance state they inhabited. Every interaction was a roll of the dice, and the stakes had just been raised by the reality of Barrow's looming presence. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was no more welcoming. Lavinia Vance intercepted her daughter in the hallway, her face drawn and pale. "Your father is planning to announce the engagement on Sunday," she said, her voice trembling. "He wishes for you to wear the blue silk." Evelyn looked at her mother, searching for an ally, but found only a mirror of her own past defeat. Lavinia had survived by retreating. Evelyn realized she would have to survive by advancing. The conversation in the forge had planted a seed. If she was to avoid the fate of becoming Arthur Barrow's property, she would have to shatter the iron structure of her life rather than remain inside it. The tension of the past 3 days, the dinner, the threats from Graves, the confession to Caleb, had forged her fear into a cold, hard resolve. She would not be sold. The oppressive heat of August broke on the 5th with a sudden torrential downpour that turned the red clay roads of the estate into impassable rivers of mud. It was in this deluge that the foundation of the planned rebellion began to solidify. Evelyn, sequestered in the library under the pretense of organizing her father's correspondence, found a rare moment of privacy. She drafted a note on a scrap of paper, the ink bleeding slightly in the damp air. The message was cryptic, a necessity of survival. "The wolf comes early, we must speak, tonight." She folded the paper into a tight square and secreted it into the pocket of her apron. The act of writing it was a tangible step away from the passivity that had defined her life. She was no longer merely a victim of her father's ambition, but an active participant in a dangerous game of subterfuge. The risk of the note being discovered was high, yet the risk of inaction had become intolerable. Slipping the message to Caleb required a level of logistical cunning that Evelyn had never before attempted. She waited until the dinner service, when the household staff was in a flurry of motion between the kitchen and the dining room. Mered, the head housekeeper, was distracted by a spilled soup. Evelyn moved to the sideboard where the servants collected trays, her heart pounding in her ears. She caught the eye of a young kitchen worker, a boy named Thomas, who often ran errands for the forge. Pressing the folded note into his palm, along with a silver coin, she whispered, "For the blacksmith. Urgent. A request for a latch repair." The boy's eyes widened, but the weight of the coin and the authority in her voice stilled his questions. He nodded once and disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. The conspiracy had now expanded to include a third party, increasing the surface area for potential exposure. Night fell with a heavy silence, the storm leaving behind a thick, swirling fog that clung to the ground. Evelyn waited until the house settled into its nocturnal rhythm, the snores of her father drifting through the thin walls. She dressed in dark clothing, a practicality that felt alien compared to her usual silks. Slipping out through the servants' entrance, she moved into the damp air, the mud sucking at her boots. The walk to the forge was a journey through a landscape transformed by darkness, every shadow seeming to conceal the watchful eyes of Graves or a patrol. When she reached the outbuilding, the door was slightly ajar, a sliver of amber light cutting through the gloom. Caleb was waiting. He stood by the cooling trough, his silhouette framed against the dying embers of the hearth. The air inside smelled of wet ash and ozone, a stark, primitive scent that underscored the urgency of their meeting. "You should not have come," Caleb said, though his voice lacked conviction. The danger of their proximity was palpable, a living thing that crowded the small room. Evelyn stepped closer, closing the door behind her to shut out the world. "Barrow arrives in 3 weeks," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My father has moved the wedding to secure his political allies before the winter session." The timeline was a guillotine blade descending. Caleb turned to face her fully, the orange glow of the coals highlighting the tension in his jaw. 3 weeks, he repeated. "That is no time to forge a plan. That is no time to run." The word "run" hung between them, the first spoken acknowledgement of the only viable path. It was a word that carried the weight of death if they failed, and the terrifying promise of the unknown if they succeeded. "We have no choice," Evelyn replied, her voice hardening. "I cannot marry him." "And you?" She hesitated, the reality of his existence crushing down on her. "Graves watches you. He knows we have spoken. If I leave, he will kill you out of spite or sell you to the cotton fields to erase the evidence." Caleb nodded slowly. He was under no illusions about the overseer's malice. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. A fleeting, electric contact that was neither an accident nor a mistake. It was a pact. "If we run," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. We need more than a head start. We need a path. There are people, whispers of a route north, but it requires coin and concealment. The logistical reality of escape began to intrude on the emotional impetus. They were not just lovers defying convention. They were fugitives planning a heist of their own lives. The sudden sharp sound of a twig snapping outside the forge extinguished the fragile intimacy of the moment. Both of them froze, their heads snapping toward the door. The shadows under the sill shifted, and the heavy thud of boots on the packed earth announced a visitor. Caleb moved with lightning speed, grabbing a heavy iron bar and positioning himself in front of Evelyn, a protective gesture that defied every social norm of the South. The door did not open. Instead, a low, gravelly voice drifted through the wood. "Fire's low, Caleb," Silas Graves called out, his tone mocking. "Wouldn't want the senator's finest to catch a chill." He did not enter, nor did he accuse. He merely announced his presence, a predator toying with its prey. The silence stretched for 10 agonizing seconds before the boots crunched away into the night, leaving the air in the forge toxic with terror. Evelyn exhaled, a ragged sound in the quiet. Graves had not discovered them in a compromising position, but his presence at that specific hour was a clear signal. He knew something was amiss, or at least suspected enough to instill fear. "He is tightening the net," Caleb murmured, setting the iron bar down with a clang. "That was a warning. He wants us to know we are being watched." The realization that their window of opportunity was shrinking by the hour galvanized Evelyn. Fear, previously a paralyzing agent, now acted as a catalyst. The stakes had escalated from personal ruin to life and death. "We cannot wait for a perfect plan," she said, urgency sharpening her tone. "We must leave before Barrow arrives, before Graves decides to act on his suspicions." "We need the underground path," Caleb stated, shifting the conversation to immediate logistics. "I know a man, Moses, who works the riverboats. He has spoken of stations north of here, safe houses in the mountains." The mention of the Underground Railroad, though not named as such in the text, introduced a tangible mechanism for their escape. It was no longer a fantasy of flight, but a logistical operation. Evelyn nodded, her mind racing through the resources she could access. "I have access to the household funds," she said. "Small amounts, not enough to be noticed immediately. And jewelry, my mother's emerald brooch." The currency of her privilege was about to be converted into the fuel for her liberation. They spent the next minutes hashing out the barest bones of a route, a desperate cartography drawn in whispers. As they spoke, the dynamic between them shifted from one of shared suffering to active partnership. The barriers of race and class, insurmountable in the daylight world, dissolved in the practicalities of survival. Caleb sketched a rough map in the soot on the workbench, indicating roads to avoid and terrain that offered cover. Evelyn contributed her knowledge of the railway schedules and the patrol patterns of the local militia. For the first time, she was utilizing her education and social position not to uphold the system, but to dismantle her place within it. The moral thesis of the narrative was being physically enacted. Freedom was not given, but engineered through intellect and sheer will. The intellectual parity between them, so often suppressed by the rigid hierarchy of the South, became their greatest tactical asset. The hour was growing late, and the risk of Evelyn's absence being discovered increased with every passing minute. They finalized their agreement. The departure would happen the following week, under the cover of the new moon. "I will find you when the time comes," Caleb promised, his hand grasping hers firmly this time, a deliberate gesture of commitment. "Stay alive until then, Miss Evelyn." The use of her title stung, a reminder of the world they were about to reject, but she accepted it as a mask they both still needed to wear. She nodded, squeezing his hand in return. "Evelyn," she corrected him softly. "My name is Evelyn." The reclamation of her identity was the final piece of the rebellion, a rejection of the roles assigned to them by Senator Vance and the society that sustained him. Slipping out of the forge, Evelyn melted back into the fog-shrouded landscape. The return journey to the mansion was fraught with a new kind of tension, not the fear of being caught, but the burden of the secret she now carried. Every creak of the floorboards and every rustle of the wind seemed to whisper of their conspiracy. As she climbed back through the servants' entrance and crept up the stairs to her room, she felt the weight of the coming days pressing down on her. The mansion, once a symbol of her security, now felt like a holding cell. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic breathing of the house. The wheels were in motion. The moral arc of her life was bending toward a dangerous, unknown horizon, and there was no turning back. The moral pivot of the summer occurred on August 8th, a date that local oral historians would later cite as the catalyst for the Vance estate's unraveling. The death of old Abel, an enslaved field hand who had worked the Vance soil for 40 years, passed without notice in the senator's ledger. To the white ownership, Abel was simply a line item depreciated to zero value, his body finally surrendering to the exhaustion of a lifetime of labor. However, in the slave quarters, his passing was a moment of profound communal grief. The burial was scheduled for dusk in the makeshift cemetery behind the tobacco barns, a grim ritual usually conducted in silence to avoid attracting the attention of the overseer. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. The accumulated weight of the summer's brutality and the whispered hopes of rebellion demanded a voice. Caleb, standing at the foot of the shallow grave, broke the traditional silence, his deep baritone carrying across the stillness of the fields. Abel was not a tool, Caleb declared, his voice steady despite the danger of the words. He was a man. He had a name. He loved, and he suffered, and he deserves to be mourned as more than a loss of property. The testimony of those present, preserved in the fragmented memories of their descendants, describes a collective intake of breath. This was not the whispered defiance of the forge. It was a public indictment of the system, spoken before witnesses. The assertion of humanity over commodity was the ultimate heresy in the eyes of the planter class. Caleb spoke for only a few minutes, but the resonance of his eulogy shattered the veneer of order that Graves had fought to maintain. It was a political act as much as a spiritual one, and it demanded a response from the hierarchy. Silas Graves, alerted to the gathering by a loyal informant, arrived on horseback as the final handfuls of dirt were thrown onto the grave. He did not interrupt immediately. Instead, he sat mounted in the twilight, his face a mask of cold fury. He had heard enough. The eulogy was a direct challenge to his authority and a violation of the strict code that forbade enslaved people from assembling without explicit permission. More importantly, it was an opportunity. Graves understood that Senator Vance could not ignore such a public display of insubordination, especially with the Barrow alliance hanging in the balance. He turned his horse and rode back to the main house, his mind already constructing the narrative that would ensure severe punishment. The incident provided the perfect pretext to break the blacksmith's spirit before he could cause further disruption. The following morning, the humid air of the estate was thick with a palpable sense of dread. Senator Vance, informed of the sedition in the quarters, convened a tribunal of sorts on the rear porch. Graves stood by his side, presenting the event not as a funeral, but as an unauthorized assembly bordering on insurrection. "The man spoke of rights, Senator," Graves reported, his voice oozing with false concern. "He preached equality in front of the field hands. If left unchecked, such ideas will spread like rot. Evelyn, lingering in the hallway just out of sight, felt the blood drain from her face. She recognized the machinery of justice in the South for what it was: a theater of terror designed to enforce submission. Her father's reaction was immediate and devoid of sentiment. He could not risk appearing weak with Barrow's delegation due to arrive. "Bring him to the main yard," Vance ordered. "Make an example." Caleb was seized by 3 white hired hands while exiting the forge. He did not resist, his body limp with resignation, knowing that struggle would only compound the violence. They dragged him to the whipping post that stood near the carriage block, a permanent and ominous fixture in the center of the estate's operations. The entire enslaved population was ordered to assemble, a calculated display of power meant to terrorize the witnesses as much as the victim. Evelyn watched from an upper window, her knuckles white as she gripped the sill. She was witnessing the cost of the defiance she had nurtured in the darkness of the forge. The reality of the system she sought to escape was playing out in brutal clarity below. The connection between her and Caleb was no longer a secret intimacy. It was the fuse that had lit this explosion. Graves administered the punishment with a methodical cruelty, using a braided leather whip designed to maximize pain without permanently disabling the victim. Property still needed to be functional. The lash cut through the air, landing with a sickening crack against Caleb's back. Evelyn turned away after the first strike, unable to watch, but she could not shut out the sound. Historical accounts of such punishments often emphasized the silence of the victim as a point of pride, and Caleb did not scream. He absorbed the pain with a stoicism that only infuriated Graves further. The whipping was not merely about correction. It was a ritual of dehumanization, a public reminder that the body belonged to the master, not the man. When the punishment concluded, Caleb was cut down from the post. He collapsed into the dust, his back a ruin of raw flesh, yet he raised his head briefly to scan the crowd. His eyes, filled with a mixture of agony and unyielding resolve, found the window where Evelyn stood. The glance was fleeting, barely a fraction of a second, but it conveyed a devastating message. The time for patience had ended. The violence had severed the last ties of fear that bound him to the Vance estate. Evelyn stepped back from the window, her hand covering her mouth to stifle a sob. The grief she felt was rapidly transmuting into a cold, hard rage. The whipping, intended to crush the spirit of rebellion, had instead crystallized her resolve. There would be no waiting for a convenient moment. They had to flee immediately, or die in this place. Down in the yard, the crowd dispersed in a terrified silence, the lesson of the morning seared into their memories. Moses, a trusted friend of Caleb, helped the blacksmith to his feet and supported him back to the forge. The medical attention was rudimentary, salt water and rags, but the psychological damage was irreversible. As they retreated, Graves stood by the porch, wiping the sweat from his brow, satisfied with his work. He had demonstrated his dominance and removed a threat to the social order. However, he remained unaware that the true threat was not the blacksmith's words, but the bond that had formed between the forge and the big house. The violence had eliminated the middle ground. There was now only submission or flight. In her room, Evelyn paced like a trapped animal. The image of Caleb's bloodied back was seared into her vision. She realized that her previous plans of waiting for the new moon were a luxury they could no longer afford. Every hour they remained on the estate increased the likelihood that Graves would find a reason to kill Caleb, or that her father would accelerate the wedding to secure his political alliance. She sat at her writing desk, her hand shaking violently, and scrawled a single line on a piece of paper. "Tonight, we go tonight." The urgency of the message was a hammer blow to their previous caution. The tragedy of Abel's death and the brutality of Caleb's punishment had forced their hand. The logistics of the escape now had to be compressed into a matter of hours rather than days. Evelyn gathered the emerald brooch and the small hoard of banknotes she had accumulated, stuffing them into a hidden pocket sewn into the lining of her traveling cloak. She moved with a frantic efficiency, every sound in the hallway causing her to freeze. She needed to get the message to Caleb, but the estate was on high alert. Graves was patrolling with doubled vigilance, his presence a looming shadow over every path. The stakes had escalated beyond scandal. They were now playing for their lives against a system that had just demonstrated its capacity for ruthless violence. Evelyn found Mered in the kitchen, the housekeeper's face drawn with the weight of what she had witnessed from the servants' hall. The usually stern woman looked at Evelyn with a startling clarity, a recognition of the rebellion brewing beneath the silk dress. "The blacksmith needs water," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I will take it to him." It was a flimsy excuse, but the authority of the White Mistress was still a shield. Mered did not protest. Instead, she handed Evelyn the bucket and turned away, offering a silent complicity. Evelyn walked out the back door, the bucket heavy in her hand, not carrying water, but carrying the declaration of their immediate departure. The moral crisis of the summer had reached its terminus. The time for waiting was over. The transition from the brutal clarity of the yard to the shadowed interior of the mansion did little to temper Evelyn's resolve. She moved through the hallways with a newfound terrifying purpose, the image of Caleb's bloodied back serving as a constant fuel. However, she had not anticipated the intervention of her own lineage. Lavinia Vance, usually confined to her chaise longue with imaginary ailments, appeared in the upstairs gallery, her silhouette framed against the dying light of the afternoon. She did not look frail. Instead, she possessed the rigid posture of a woman who had witnessed a lifetime of necessary silences. "You will not take the water yourself," Lavinia said softly, descending the stairs with a fluid grace that belied her age. "Graves is watching the path with a telescope. If you go to him now, you condemn him." It was an astonishing admission, a clear signal that the matriarch understood exactly what was transpiring below the surface of the household's decorum. Evelyn froze, the bucket handle cutting into her palm. Her mother stood between her and the door, but the expression on Lavinia's face was not one of obstruction. It was a mask of tragic recognition. "You have his eyes," Lavinia continued, her voice barely audible. "That stubbornness, that belief that love can conquer the ledger books." She reached into the pocket of her lavender morning dress and withdrew a small velvet pouch, the contents clinking with the metallic weight of coin. "I was 19 when they brought a young man to fix the stonework on the east wing. He spoke 3 languages. He looked at me as if I were a person, not a deed to be transferred." The confession was a rupture in the family history, a revelation that the current rebellion was actually a generational echo. The pouch contained a sum of 120 gold dollars, a clandestine fund Lavinia had accumulated over 20 years of selling off small trinkets and hoarding household allowances. It was a king's ransom for a fugitive, enough to bribe station masters and purchase silence along the route. "I chose the estate," Lavinia admitted, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "I chose the safety of this cage. I let them sell him south, and I have lived every day since in a funeral shroud of silk." She pressed the money into Evelyn's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "You must not make my mistake. A life without the one who sees you is not a life. It is merely an existence." The transfer of funds was a transfer of hope, a maternal absolution for the sin Evelyn was about to commit against the family name. There is a wagon leaving from the river landing at midnight, Lavinia continued, shifting from confessor to strategist. It carries medical supplies to the hospital in Augusta. The driver is a freedman named Thomas Webb. He owes me a debt of silence from the summer of the cholera outbreak. The specificity of the plan was startling, revealing that Lavinia had been harboring these thoughts far longer than Evelyn had realized. She provided the details with the efficiency of a military commander, the location of the handoff, the signal to the driver, and the cover story Evelyn was to use if intercepted before reaching the gate. The mother was not merely facilitating an escape. She was actively dismantling the structure her husband had built, sacrificing her own social standing to grant her daughter the freedom she had denied herself. Evelyn grasped her mother's hands, the gold coins warm between their palms. "Come with us," she whispered, the offer hanging in the air like a prayer. "You do not have to stay here with him." Lavinia shook her head slowly, a sad smile gracing her lips. "My place is here now. My rebellion is to ensure you succeed. If I vanish, your father will mobilize every resource in the state within the hour. But if I am here, weeping over a runaway daughter, I can delay the pursuit until dawn." It was a calculated sacrifice. Lavinia would stay to manage the aftermath, playing the role of the distraught mother to buy the fleeing couple precious hours. The realization that her mother had been an agent of her own oppression, yet now sought to be the architect of her liberation, added a complex layer of sorrow to Evelyn's resolve. The meeting ended as quickly as it had begun. Lavinia turned back toward her chambers, straightening her spine into the posture of the senator's wife. "Go to him," she said without turning around. "Tell him to be ready. And Evelyn, do not look back. Looking back is how they catch you." The hallway returned to its usual quiet, but the air felt different, charged with the electricity of conspiracy. Evelyn secreted the gold in her hidden pocket alongside the emerald brooch. The financial barrier to their flight had been obliterated in a single conversation. They now possessed the means to navigate the Underground Railroad, turning a desperate flight into a funded operation. Evelyn made her way to the kitchen, the bucket of water now a forgotten prop. She found Mered once more, the housekeeper's face a study in silent solidarity. "I need a message taken to the forge," Evelyn said, her voice low. "It cannot wait." Mered did not ask questions. The atmosphere of the estate, thick with the aftermath of the whipping, had prepared her for drastic measures. She signaled to a young boy tasked with hauling ash, a child named Samuel, who moved like smoke through the grounds. Evelyn scribbled the revised plan on a scrap of wrapping paper. "Augusta wagon, midnight. Be ready." She folded it into a tight square and pressed it into Samuel's hand. "Do not let Graves see you," she warned. "This is life or death." Samuel slipped out the back door, melting into the twilight shadows. Evelyn watched from the window, her heart pounding in rhythm with the ticking clock on the mantel. It was 7 in the evening. 5 hours remained until the wagon departed. The time stretched before her, an agonizing expanse filled with potential for discovery. She retreated to her room to finalize her preparations, stripping off the delicate fabrics of her day dress and donning the sturdy rough-spun clothing she had secreted away. A practical outfit, more suited for a domestic servant than a senator's daughter. The transformation in the mirror was jarring. The fine lady was disappearing, replaced by a traveler ready for the mud and the cold. As she packed a small satchel with dried meat and a change of linen, the reality of her mother's sacrifice weighed on her. Lavinia Vance would face the wrath of Julian Vance alone. The senator's political ambitions would be shattered by his daughter's flight, and he would undoubtedly lash out at the nearest target. Evelyn felt a pang of guilt, sharp and piercing, but she crushed it beneath the weight of necessity. She could not save her mother from the life she had chosen, but she could validate her mother's sacrifice by succeeding. The gold in her pocket was not just currency, it was Lavinia's soul, redeemed through her daughter's escape. The clock struck 9. The estate was settling into its nightly routine. Senator Vance was in his study, finalizing the contract with Barrow's solicitors via courier. Graves was making his final rounds before retiring to the overseer's cottage, satisfied that the day's violence had restored order. The false calm was a brittle shell over the chaos about to erupt. Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed, the satchel hidden beneath her cloak. She ran through the plan in her mind. The path to the river landing, the signal to Thomas Webb, the rendezvous with Caleb. Every step was a calculated risk, a roll of the dice against a system designed to ensure she lost. Outside, the fog began to roll in from the river, a providential shroud that would mask their movements. Evelyn took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. She thought of Caleb's back, raw and bleeding, and the steady gaze that had found her in the crowd. She thought of Abel's unmarked grave, and the words spoken over it. The moral imperative was clear. She stood up, slinging the satchel over her shoulder. The waiting was over. The preparation was complete. It was time to leave the gilded cage of the Vance estate behind and step into the dangerous unknown of the world beyond. The carefully constructed timeline for the Vance estate's social season disintegrated on the afternoon of August 9th. Senator Vance, anticipating a routine week of preparation for the wedding announcement, received a telegram that altered the calculus of his political maneuvering. Arthur Barrow, citing a sudden shift in his shipping schedules and a desire to secure his domestic arrangements before the fall market volatility, informed the senator that he would be arriving in Milledgeville not in 3 weeks, but in 4 days. The compressed schedule was a power play, a signal that Barrow held the leverage in their alliance and intended to exercise it. For Evelyn, this news acted as a hammer blow to her lingering caution. The message was intercepted by Murad before it reached the senator's study, and the housekeeper rushed it to Evelyn in the garden. The urgency of the text, requesting an immediate confirmation of the nuptials, stripped away the luxury of a midnight departure planned for weeks hence. Evelyn's reaction was instantaneous and decisive. The leisurely pace of the new moon plan was rendered obsolete by Barrow's impatience. She realized that waiting even 24 hours might trap her within a perimeter of wedding guests and heightened security. The timeline for the escape had to be accelerated from a future date to the immediate present. She penned a frantic note to Caleb, the handwriting shaky and rushed. "Barrow comes in 4 days. We leave tonight. The Augusta wagon, be ready." The message was a command, abandoning the careful subtleties of their previous conversations for the raw necessity of survival. She signaled Samuel, the young runner, who had been lingering near the hydrangeas, his small face pale but determined. "Run," she whispered, pressing the paper into his hand. "Do not stop for anyone." With the message dispatched, Evelyn turned her attention to the immediate logistics of her disappearance. She could not pack a trunk without arousing the suspicion of the maids, so she was forced to leave behind almost every material possession she owned. She changed into her traveling clothes, the rough dark fabric that would stain easily in the mud, under the guise of preparing for a ride in the countryside. The gold coins from her mother were distributed into hidden pockets sewn into the lining of her cloak, the weight of them a constant reminder of the stakes. She took only what was essential: a tinderbox, a small knife for cutting through briars, and a vial of laudanum stolen from her mother's medicine cabinet, a grim option for last resort self-destruction should capture become imminent. The preparation was less about gathering supplies and more about stripping her life down to the barest essentials of existence. The estate was a labyrinth of potential informants, and Evelyn knew that her absence would be noticed the moment the dinner bell rang. To mitigate this, she employed a classic misdirection. She sought out her father in his study, where he was composing a response to Barrow. "Father," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "The excitement of Mr. Barrow's early arrival has given me a megrim. I wish to retire early and take a light supper in my room. Please give my apologies to Mother." The senator barely looked up from his paperwork, waving her away with a distracted assent. By establishing an alibi of illness, she bought herself several hours of unobserved time, turning the patriarch's indifference into her greatest tactical asset. As dusk fell over Milledgeville, the shadows lengthened across the manicured lawns of the Vance estate. Evelyn watched from her window as Graves completed his rounds, his lantern bobbing in the twilight like a malevolent firefly. He seemed confident, perhaps believing that the day's earlier demonstration of brutality had secured the peace. He retired to his cottage, the door slamming shut with a finality that signaled the beginning of the window of opportunity. Evelyn waited, counting the minutes until the house settled into its nocturnal rhythm. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant mournful call of a whippoorwill. It was the sound of the South at rest, unaware that a rebellion was stirring in its midst. At 9:30, Evelyn made her move. She opened her bedroom door slowly, wincing at the creak of the hinges. The hallway was empty. She moved on stocking feet, carrying her boots in her hand to muffle the sound. She navigated the back stairs, the servants' route, avoiding the main hall where the portraits of her ancestors seemed to judge her flight. She passed the kitchen, where the dying embers of the cook fire cast a faint red glow. Mered was there, waiting. The housekeeper pressed a small bundle of cornbread and dried beef into Evelyn's hands. "God go with you, miss," Mered whispered, her voice trembling. It was a benediction and a farewell, a severing of the tie between mistress and servant that had defined their lives. Evelyn slipped out the back door into the humid night. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and decaying leaves, a sensory overload that grounded her in the physical reality of the moment. She moved swiftly across the lawn, staying low to avoid the sightlines from the overseer's cottage. The darkness was her ally, the new moon rendering her a ghost against the landscape. She made her way toward the orchard, where the trees provided cover from the open fields. Every rustle of wind in the leaves sounded like a footstep, every shadow a potential pursuer. The psychological weight of leaving behind everything she had ever known warred with the physical need to move, to run, to escape the looming figure of Barrow and the oppressive reach of her father. She reached the designated meeting point, a large, gnarled oak near the service road. Minutes later, her chest heaving with suppressed panic. The spot was empty. For a terrifying moment, she feared she had miscalculated, that Caleb had been intercepted, or that the message had never reached him. The silence stretched, agonizing and absolute. Then, a figure emerged from the tree line, moving with a silent, predatory grace. It was Caleb. He carried a small sack over his shoulder, his face obscured by the darkness. He was walking stiffly, the wounds on his back clearly still causing him agony, but his posture was erect. They did not speak. Words were superfluous now. The mere fact of his presence was the confirmation she needed. They were both committed to the impossible. They moved together toward the service road, keeping to the edge of the gravel to mask the sound of their footsteps. The route to the river landing was 2 miles through dense underbrush, a path Caleb knew intimately from his work hauling iron ore. He led the way, his senses attuned to the dangers of the landscape. They crossed a shallow creek, the cold water a shock against Evelyn's skin, soaking the hem of her dress. They scrambled up the muddy bank, tearing their clothes on brambles. The physical hardship was immediate and brutal, a stark contrast to the cushioned life Evelyn had left behind. Yet she did not falter. The fear of capture was a whip at her back, driving her forward through the pain and exhaustion. The sound of the river grew louder, masking their approach. Through the trees, they could see the faint outline of the landing dock and the darker shape of a covered wagon. Thomas Webb was already there, checking the harness on a team of mules. He was a man of few words, his face a stoic mask in the dim light. "Mrs. Vance said you would come," he murmured, his voice barely carrying over the sound of the water. He gestured to the back of the wagon. "Get under the canvas. There is space between the crates of quinine. Do not make a sound until we are past the county line." The mention of her mother's name was a jarring reminder of the sacrifice being made miles behind them. Evelyn and Caleb climbed into the wagon bed, squeezing into the narrow, suffocating space between the medical supplies. The canvas cover plunged them into absolute darkness. They lay side by side, their bodies pressed together in the cramped confines. Evelyn reached out in the dark and found Caleb's hand, gripping it tightly. The wagon lurched forward, the wheels grinding against the gravel road. They were moving. The escape was no longer a plan. It was an action. As the wagon rolled away from the landing, carrying them toward the uncertain promise of Augusta and the north, Evelyn felt the vibration of the road through the floorboards. The Vance estate, the whipping post, and the looming threat of Arthur Barrow were beginning to recede into the distance, swallowed by the vast, indifferent Georgia night. The discovery of the empty room shattered the calculated serenity of the Vance estate. At precisely 7 in the morning on August 10th, a chambermaid entered Evelyn's quarters to draw the curtains, only to find the bed unslept in, the sheets cold to the touch. The discovery of the short, brutal note left on the pillow, addressed simply to Father, sent a tremor through the household foundation. Within minutes, Senator Vance was storming through the halls, his face mottled with a mix of rage and disbelief. The note, later destroyed but transcribed in the family's private correspondence, was a declaration of independence. "I refuse to be bartered. I am gone where your reach cannot find me. Do not look for me." The wording was a direct assault on the patriarchal authority Vance had spent a lifetime cultivating, transforming a domestic disappointment into a public crisis. Silas Graves arrived at the main house to find the senator in a state of near apoplexy. The overseer's initial confusion quickly gave way to a cold, calculating realization. He had suspected a brewing impropriety, but the scale of the defection, a white woman fleeing with an enslaved man, surpassed his worst estimations. Vance wasted no time on recriminations against the overseer. His focus was singular and predatory. He ordered Graves to saddle the swiftest horses and to enlist every available man in the county. "I want them found," Vance commanded, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "I do not care about the condition in which they are returned, only that they are returned." The order effectively deputized a lynch mob, granting them carte blanche to use whatever violence necessary to restore the social order. The mobilization was rapid and terrifyingly efficient. By 8 in the morning, the town of Milledgeville was buzzing with the rumor of the scandal. Posters were printed hastily, offering a reward of $1,000 for information leading to the capture of a Negro man named Caleb and the return of Evelyn Vance. The discrepancy in the wording was telling. Caleb was to be captured, Evelyn returned. The economic weight of the reward, equivalent to nearly 2 years' wages for a skilled laborer, ensured that every bounty hunter and opportunistic farmer within a 50-mile radius would be scouring the roads. The telegraph lines buzzed with descriptions, transforming the young lovers into fugitives before they had even crossed the county line. Meanwhile, Thomas Webb's wagon trundled northward, the rhythmic jostle of the wheels masking the sound of breathing in the hidden compartment. For Evelyn and Caleb, the journey was an exercise in endurance. The space beneath the canvas was airless and suffocatingly hot, smelling of damp burlap and medicinal tonic. Every jolt of the wagon sent a spike of pain through Caleb's wounded back, but he remained silent, his jaw clenched. Evelyn kept her hand pressed against his, a tether to sanity in the pitch blackness. They communicated in squeezes and touches, unable to speak for fear that a passing rider might hear. The psychological strain of remaining motionless while the world moved blindly around them was immense, a test of nerve that neither had anticipated. Near the town of Sparta, the wagon slowed abruptly. The sound of hooves and the sharp bark of a command pierced the canvas. "Halt! State your business!" It was a local patrol, deputized in the wake of the news. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. Thomas Webb's voice was steady, bored even. "Medical supplies for the Augusta Hospital. I have a manifest." The tension stretched as the patrolman circled the wagon. A hand slapped the canvas cover, inches from Evelyn's face. She stopped breathing, her fingers digging into Caleb's arm. After an agonizing minute, the patrolman grunted. "Move along, but keep your eyes open. The senator's girl is gone." The wagon lurched forward again, leaving the danger behind, but the close call underscored the tightening net. By midday, the wagon had reached the relative safety of the dense woodlands that bordered the river road. Webb pulled the wagon to a stop in a secluded copse to water the mules and allow the fugitives a moment of respite. They climbed out stiffly, blinking in the harsh daylight. Caleb moved with difficulty, his shirt stained with fresh seepage from his wounds. Webb handed them a canteen and a map drawn on oilskin. "The main roads will be watched by nightfall," he warned. "You must cut through the hills toward the Cherokee lands. There is a Quaker settlement near the border that will shelter you." The plan was shifting from a carriage ride to a grueling overland trek. The separation from Webb marked the true beginning of their isolation. As the wagon disappeared down the dusty track, Evelyn felt the crushing weight of the silence that settled over the forest. They were alone in a landscape that could be either sanctuary or trap. Caleb took the lead, his tracking skills put to use navigating the uneven terrain. The luxury of the Vance estate felt a world away. There were no servants to prepare food or draw baths, only the relentless buzz of insects and the oppressive heat. Evelyn realized with a start that she did not know how to build a fire or identify safe water. She was a dependent creature in a wild world, forced to rely entirely on the man she had chosen to follow. Their progress was agonizingly slow. Caleb's injuries limited his pace, and Evelyn's soft city boots were ill-suited for the rocky ascent. By late afternoon, her feet were blistered and bleeding, but she refused to complain, knowing that to stop was to die. The fear of the dogs, the sound of baying hounds that haunted her imagination, kept her moving long after her body begged for rest. The urgency of the pursuit, spurred by the $1,000 reward, loomed over them. They knew that Vance would spare no expense. His honor was at stake, and in the South, honor was a currency more valuable than gold. As dusk fell, they encountered their first major obstacle, a tributary of the Savannah River, swollen from the recent rains. The bridge was a mile to the east, but that would mean exposing themselves on a public road. Caleb studied the rushing water, his expression grim. "We must wade across," he said. "It is deep, but the current is manageable." Evelyn looked at the dark, churning water, with fear. She had never learned to swim properly, a frivolous skill deemed unnecessary for a lady. Caleb saw her hesitation and tightened his grip on the map. I will hold you, he promised. The water cannot take us if we move together. The crossing was a nightmare of cold and motion. The water rose to Evelyn's waist, then her chest, the current tugging at her dress with insistent force. Caleb braced himself against the rocky bottom, his arms locking around her as they navigated the slipstream. The pain in his back must have been excruciating, but he did not utter a sound. Halfway across, Evelyn's foot slipped on a mossy stone, and she gasped, swallowing water. Caleb hauled her up, his strength shocking in its intensity. They stumbled onto the far bank, soaked and shivering, the chill a stark contrast to the humid air. The crossing had cost them precious time and body heat, but it had also placed a barrier between them and the easiest path for the horses. They pressed on through the night, guided by the stars and Caleb's intimate knowledge of the wilderness. The terrain grew rougher, the vegetation thicker. They were moving into the foothills, leaving the cotton country behind for the pine forests of the north. As the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon, they collapsed in a thicket of briars, too exhausted to move another step. They had covered perhaps 15 miles, a paltry distance against the vastness of the journey to Pennsylvania. The reality of their flight was setting in. It was not a dash for freedom, but a war of attrition against the landscape and the men who hunted them. They huddled together for warmth, the gold coins in Evelyn's pocket pressing against her ribs, a cold comfort against the uncertainty of the coming day. The days that followed blurred into a grueling test of endurance, a stark contrast to the structured rhythm of the plantation. For 10 days, Evelyn and Caleb navigated the treacherous backwoods of Georgia and South Carolina, moving only under the cover of darkness. The lush, deceptive beauty of the southern landscape concealed 1,000 hazards. Venomous snakes coiled in the underbrush, thorny vines that tore at their skin, and the ever-present, suffocating humidity. Caleb's injuries, aggravated by the damp and the exertion, began to fester, requiring Evelyn to apply poultices of wild herbs she learned to identify from necessity. The refined daughter of a senator was rapidly shedding the layers of her privilege, learning to walk silently, to sleep in hollow logs, and to tolerate the gnawing ache of hunger. The transformation was visceral. Her hands, once soft and pale, grew calloused and stained with the red clay of the earth. On the third night, they reached a station on the invisible railway, a dilapidated barn owned by a white yeoman farmer named Harold in the foothills of the Appalachians. The man did not speak much, communicating largely through gestures and the provision of coarse cornmeal and cured pork. This isolation was a strategic necessity. Trust was a luxury they could not afford. While the popular image of the Underground Railroad often emphasizes grand networks of abolitionists, the reality for many fugitives was a fragmented series of isolated sympathizers who risked ruin for the cause. Harold provided them with a rough map of the terrain ahead, warning them that the reward posters from Milledgeville had reached as far as Greenville. The $1,000 bounty had transformed them from local runaways into high-value targets, incentivizing even the poorest farmers to scour the woods. The psychological toll of the journey began to manifest in silence. Evelyn, raised in a world of constant social interaction and leisure, found the crushing solitude of the forest overwhelming. The only voice she heard was Caleb's, and even that was reduced to urgent whispers. They developed a system of signals, a tap on the shoulder for danger, a squeeze of the hand for reassurance. This nonverbal communication deepened their bond, stripping away the artifice of courtship and leaving only the raw instinct for mutual survival. Yet, the weight of her mother's sacrifice and the uncertainty of Lavinia's fate gnawed at Evelyn during the daylight hours when they lay hidden in the shadows, staring at the canopy of leaves. As they crossed into North Carolina, the terrain shifted from dense forest to rocky inclines. Their progress slowed considerably, Caleb's strength waning with every mile. The specter of Senator Vance's wrath was no longer an abstract threat. It was physically present in the form of search parties. Twice they were forced to abandon their path and hide in muddy ditches as riders thundered past, calling out descriptions to their dogs. The sound of the hounds became a persistent auditory hallucination for Evelyn, a phantom menace that haunted even her waking hours. The realization that they were being actively hunted by professionals, men who tracked runaway slaves for a living, added a new layer of terror to their nocturnal marches. On the 8th night, they encountered a Quaker community near the Virginia border. The Friends, as they called themselves, were the backbone of the abolitionist network in the region. A woman named Sarah, her face lined with years of quiet defiance, took them into her cellar. For the first time in over a week, they were able to sleep horizontally and wash in clean water. Sarah provided them with a crucial intelligence update. The slave catchers were concentrating their efforts on the main roads to Richmond, assuming the fugitives would seek the fastest route north. This information forced Caleb to reconsider their strategy. "They are hurting us," he whispered to Evelyn. "They want us to go where the crowds are. We must take the mountains." The decision to traverse the mountain passes was a gamble with their lives. The nights were colder, the terrain more treacherous, and the scarcity of food more acute. Evelyn's elegant traveling clothes were reduced to rags, barely offering protection against the biting wind. She wrapped herself in the rough wool blanket provided by Sarah, her body trembling not just from the cold, but from the onset of exhaustion. Yet, in this physical degradation, a new resilience emerged. She stopped complaining about the blisters and the hunger, her mind sharpened by the singular focus of the border. The woman who had once lamented the choice of a silk ribbon was now calculating travel times based on the angle of the moon and the flow of mountain streams. Their arrival in Virginia marked a critical juncture in the journey. The state was a bastion of the slave power, and the laws were strictly enforced. They traveled by night, guided by the North Star, and hid during the day in abandoned mining shafts. The physical proximity to freedom made the danger feel more acute, a paradox of the escape. Every white face they glimpsed from the shadows represented a potential betrayer. Caleb, familiar with the topography from stories passed down through the slave network, navigated them around the larger towns, leading them through briar thickets and over jagged ridges. The distance they covered was measured in mere miles, a slow crawl toward liberty. The final push toward Pennsylvania began on the 13th night. They were exhausted, starving, and on the edge of collapse. The landscape here was a patchwork of small farms and dense woodlands, interspersed with the occasional imposing plantation house. The contrast between the pastoral calm of the scenery and the violence of their flight was jarring. They encountered a freedman named Obadiah, a woodcutter who worked the borderlands. For a portion of the gold coins provided by Lavinia, Obadiah guided them to a crossing point on the state line. He warned them that the hunters were getting closer, their tactics becoming more desperate as the trail grew colder. "Senator Vance has hired a specialist," Obadiah warned, his voice low as he pointed toward a narrow ravine. "A man named Sutton. He doesn't use dogs. He uses instinct. He will be waiting where you least expect it." The name Sutton struck fear into Caleb's heart. The tracker was a legend among the enslaved for his uncanny ability to predict the movements of runaways. This information shifted the dynamic of the escape from a physical test to a psychological duel. They were no longer just outrunning a mob. They were being hunted by a predator who understood their desperation. As they approached the Pennsylvania border, the terrain opened up into a broad valley. The lights of a small town twinkled in the distance, a symbol of the civilization they sought to join. But between them and that light lay a gauntlet of uncertainty. They were close, dangerously close, to the threshold of freedom. The promise of a new life was tangible, yet the fear of capture, at the final moment, paralyzed them both. They crouched in the tree line, watching the road, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether they lived as free people or died as examples. The border was not just a line on a map. It was a barrier of blood and iron that they had yet to breach. The border of Pennsylvania materialized not as a line of liberation, but as a jagged precipice of stone and shadow. On the 14th night, guided only by the faint illumination of a waning moon, Evelyn and Caleb reached the edge of a gorge that separated the slaveholding South from the theoretical freedom of the North. A worn marker, half obscured by moss, indicated the state line, yet the geography itself mocked their progress. The land dropped away sharply into a rocky ravine where the Conewago Creek roared far below. The water was a distant ribbon of white noise, a natural barrier that no legal statute could smooth. Caleb, breathing heavily from the ascent and the lingering pain of his wounds, pointed toward a narrow deer trail that switchbacked down the cliff face. "The bridge is 2 miles east," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "But they will be watching it." The decision to avoid the bridge was instinctive, a tactical rejection of the obvious path. However, fate, in the form of a cold mountain wind, carried a new sound up the valley. The deep, resonant baying of hounds shattered the stillness of the ridge. The tracker, Sutton, had not been fooled by their mountain detour. He had paralleled their course, waiting for the terrain to force them into the open. Within moments, the glint of lanterns bobbed through the trees behind them, cutting through the darkness like predatory eyes. The hunters were closing the net, driving the fugitives toward the sheer drop. The promise of Pennsylvania, lying just yards away across an invisible line, was rendered moot by the physical reality of the gorge and the violence at their backs. Evelyn turned to face the approaching lights, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their figures silhouetted against the gloom. At their head rode Sutton, a man whose face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. His posture relaxed with the confidence of a man who had cornered his quarry a dozen times before. He dismounted slowly, checking the priming on his rifle. "Eli Sutton," Caleb murmured, the name tasting like ash. "He hunts for sport." The pursuer did not shout or threaten. He merely began to walk forward, the dogs straining at their leashes, their teeth gleaming in the lantern light. The silence of the hunter was more terrifying than the shouts of the mob. It signaled that this was a professional execution, not a passionate chase. Sutton stopped 10 yards from the cliff's edge, his rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm. "Miss Vance," he called out, his voice smooth and devoid of emotion. "Your father is offering a considerable sum for your return, and for the property standing beside you." He gestured toward Caleb with the barrel of the gun. "There is no need for this to end badly." "Step away from the edge. The law is on this side of the line." It was a cruel technicality. They stood in Pennsylvania, but the reach of the slave catcher extended across the border, backed by the Fugitive Slave Act and the weight of Senator Vance's gold. The offer of safety was a lie, and they all knew it. To return meant a life of cage for Evelyn and a death of torture for Caleb. Evelyn looked at Caleb, seeing the reflection of the lantern fire in his dark eyes. There was no fear there, only a calm, profound resignation. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and warm. "We are already free," he said, loud enough for Sutton to hear. "We have been free since the moment we chose to leave." It was a philosophical declaration, a final rejection of the system that claimed ownership over their bodies and souls. The tracker's face hardened, sensing the shift in the dynamic. He raised the rifle, centering the sight on Caleb's chest. "Last chance, girl," he warned. "Step away." The moment stretched, suspending time between the click of the rifle hammer and the roar of the water below. Evelyn squeezed Caleb's hand, a signal that transcended words. They did not step away. They stepped closer. In a sudden fluid motion, they turned toward the abyss. Sutton fired, the shot cracking through the night air, but the bullet tore through the empty space where they had stood. Evelyn and Caleb launched themselves into the void, their hands clasped together, falling into the darkness of the ravine. The plunge was an act of ultimate agency, a refusal to be captured that defied the biological imperative for self-preservation. It was a leap of faith into the only freedom the South could not touch. The impact with the water was a violent shock, a sudden immersion in freezing cold that drove the breath from Evelyn's lungs. The current of the Conwago Creek was fierce, seizing their bodies and tumbling them downstream in a chaotic swirl of foam and darkness. Evelyn lost her grip on Caleb's hand, her world reduced to the roar of the water and the burning need for air. She kicked upward, breaking the surface with a gasp, her limbs flailing against the drag of her waterlogged dress. The darkness was absolute, but the current was carrying them away from the cliff edge and the cursing of the men above. The jump, intended as a self-destruction pact by the hunters, had become a desperate aquatic escape. She clawed at the water, fighting the undertow, screaming Caleb's name into the roar of the rapids. A hand broke the surface ahead of her, grabbing a low-hanging branch on the far bank. Caleb hauled himself onto the muddy shore, turning immediately to scan the water for her. Evelyn felt a surge of adrenaline, fighting the current toward his voice. He reached out, grabbing her wrist just as she was about to be swept past, pulling her onto the rocky bank with a groan of exertion. They lay there, in the mud, shivering violently, listening to the fading shouts of Sutton and his men on the cliff above. The tracker had lost them. The night had swallowed them whole. By dawn, they had managed to build a small smokeless fire in a hollowed-out root system, drying their clothes as best they could. The survival of the fall was nothing short of a miracle, attributed by local legend to the deep channel of the creek. They were battered, bruised, and hypothermic, but they were alive, and, crucially, they were on free soil. The psychological shift was palpable. The air on this side of the border felt lighter, devoid of the crushing weight of the estate. They were no longer property to be retrieved, but criminals to be pursued, a distinction that, while dangerous, afforded them a legal ambiguity they had not possessed in Georgia. The subsequent weeks saw them integrated into the Underground Railroad proper, moving from safe house to safe house with a newfound urgency. The narrative of their leap preceded them, spreading through the abolitionist network as a testament to the desperate courage of fugitives. They eventually settled in a small Quaker community outside Philadelphia, where Caleb found work in a smithy, and Evelyn, now stripped of her accent and her past, took in mending. They married in a quiet ceremony in the winter of 1852, under the names Elias and Eleanor Freeman. The gold coins from Lavinia, still miraculously intact despite the water, provided the seed money for a modest life, built on the ruins of the old. Years later, in the chaotic years following the Civil War, the story of the Vance estate was still whispered in the social circles of Milledgeville. Senator Vance, ruined by the scandal and the war, died a bitter man, believing his daughter lost to the river. Lavinia, however, received a single, unsigned letter in 1866 containing only a pressed flower from a Pennsylvania garden. The legend of the lovers who leaped into the ravine became a localized myth in Georgia. a cautionary tale of defiance, while in the North, it was preserved as a ballad of triumph. The truth of their survival remained their most guarded secret, a private victory against a system designed to erase them. They had looked into the abyss, and instead of falling, they had learned to fly.